My name is Brock Grosso.
My name is Tyler McInnis. Brock and I were both in Jackson, Mississippi, working at the Mississippi Center for Justice. And we were each doing coalition building efforts at different points in those coalitions' lifespans. So my project was looking to bring a group of folks together to start an anti-hunger coalition in Jackson.
And I was working with a coalition called Housing Mississippi that had been in existence for about 6 years, trying to advance some policy changes at the statewide level. So because we both did coalition building, we did our HFCR on how to effectively build coalitions, and we want to start with a quote from one of our favorite coalition coordinators in Mississippi. Rims Barber says that life is a coalition. And Rims is a wonderful man who's been in Mississippi since the 1964 Freedom Summer, and from the minute he stepped on the ground, he's been building coalitions to advance progressive issues. And what he really meant by this is that if you're in a place like Mississippi where social change is hard, if you're not working in coalition with other groups, you're not going to be successful, at least in his experience. But Tyler and I both learned that bringing people together at a table to do collaboration, that's not enough. That doesn't actually lead to effective action. It takes targeted and strategic actions on behalf of coalition coordinators and members to make that happen.
So because of the need for effective coalitions in Mississippi, and because Brock and I both gained some experience doing coalition building there, we thought it would be effective to put together a coalition coordinators toolkit. So kind of a how-to guide for coalition coordinating. And so we did this by drawing on our own experience as well as interviewing 10 coalition coordinators in Mississippi that have combined over a century's worth of coalition experience.
So we combine that knowledge with our personal experience, some other resources, and built a blog, Deep South Coalitions. And here's a picture of our homepage of the blog with all of the different sections that we put on it.
Yep, and so this is the document that we kind of wish we had had when we first got to Mississippi. So today we're going to be kind of walking through some of the key takeaways or strategies that we've identified for coalition coordinators. So we're going to be talking about the benefits of coalitions, when you shouldn't form a coalition, and the 4 R's of coalitions.
Great. So we'll start with the benefits of coalitions. First, coalitions can bring increased political power around an issue, especially important in a place like Mississippi if you're trying to advance some social change work. It's a really difficult place to get that work done politically.
It's an opportunity for organizations to pool their resources, both financial or human, and that, again, that's very important in a place like Mississippi where those resources are hard to come by.
Coalitions can help to eliminate duplication in programming. Once again, important in Mississippi because of that lack of resources. Every dollar is really precious in a place where there's not a lot of money for social change and service work.
Coalitions give an opportunity for organizations to work collaboratively, and that seems very intuitive, but it's not important just for the coalition's work in the moment, but also sets up those organizations to work collaboratively in the future.
Coalitions help organizations efficiently disseminate information. A great example of this was during last year's legislative session. A group of advocates wanted to advance some payday lending reform and came up against a really well-funded, well-organized lobbying effort from banks. Surprise. So in order to even have close to a chance that these group of kind of like ragtag bunch of advocates had to really communicate well, and they ended up having a call every morning and a really active email thread, and it was that information dissemination and communication that made the fight even possible. So
we also offer an opportunity for member organizations to gain improved skills and capacities. This is a tactic that's used by the STEPS Coalition, which is an organization on the Gulf Coast of Mississippi, and they do a lot of really great leadership development with their membership.
And our last benefit is that coalitions allow consensus building around an issue across different sectors. So organizations from the for-profit, nonprofit, government, and other sectors can come together to build shared vision, values, and strategies around an issue that they may have been working on, but from their own individual angles beforehand. So I think we just want to reiterate that although these are benefits of coalitions, they don't just happen by bringing people to the table and saying, like, go ahead, do it. It takes these strategic actions that we're going to talk more about.
Right. So sometimes coalitions may not be the answer, especially depending on the issue at hand or the environment into which that the coalition is being formed. Coalitions are best suited to tackle complex social issues. So if the issue at hand is fairly straightforward, maybe a coalition isn't the best answer.
Coalitions might not be needed if there's already a single organization that's mandated or has in their mission statement to address a gap that isn't being filled. It might be more useful just to go to that organization and find out what resources they need to be more effective at their work.
Sometimes there may not be broad-based support for collaboration. This doesn't necessarily mean that a coalition shouldn't happen, but there may need to be an extra step in terms of generating that support for collaboration. So for instance, my project, the idea came about when within an existing coalition in Mississippi, it was proposed that there be a working group that addressed hunger specifically. But there wasn't a lot of support within that group to do so. So my project was born out of a need to kind of generate that support for collaboration around addressing hunger. And then also, obviously, there can be challenging interorganizational politics, and that's something we'll touch on in a few minutes.
So now we're going to move into what Tyler and I have named the 4 R's of coalitions. So if you need to cite that, you can cite us. And those 4 R's are relationships, recruitment, retention, and results. So first we're going to start with relationships, and Tyler and I both found, both through our interviews and personal experience, that relationships are the most, having strong relationships between members and between coalition coordinators and members was the most important factor in having effective coalition work. Those strong relationships help build trust, they help identify strengths in the room, and they also help give people an idea of why each organization is at the table, so you can know how to motivate different organizations to take action in your coalition. Some tactics that Tyler and I identified to build relationships were to have good one-on-one, face-to-face meetings, especially in Mississippi. That was really important. Tyler and I both came from organizing and activism cultures where phone calls and emails were used a lot, but that really did not work for us in Mississippi. So we weren't able to really move our work forward until we started taking the time to sit down with people, get to know them on a personal level. And I think that's true in other places as well. It's also important to pay attention to social identity, like race, class, and gender, when you're building relationships in coalition. From our interviews and our experience, we found that working across difference can and should happen, but your identities might affect the strategies and the way your relationships are built with other people. So as 2 white, straight men from the north coming down to Mississippi to do coalition building, we found some justified in skepticism and some mistrust when reaching out to organizations that were led by people of color. So it took us putting in that extra work, taking that extra time to really show that we were going to follow through and we wanted to include them as true partners in the work. And lastly, one thing we found in Mississippi was you have to involve people in your work that you don't agree with if they hold power in some capacity. So time and time again, we heard you have to involve people on the other side of the aisle. And whether that means actually bringing them into your coalition to be a member, or it just means you get members who have relationships with people who don't agree with you, that's kind of up to the coalition. So in Housing Mississippi, we brought in some people who had relationships with people who didn't agree with our mission. So they were able to kind of do that outreach for us and leverage some new supporters.
So it's important to have a strategic approach to recruitment, especially when you're doing a project like mine, when you're pulling together a new group of folks. So organizations we found were rightfully cautious to join, especially if a coalition is going to require that a member allocate some sort of financial or in-kind contribution. So some of the recommendations that Brock and I came up with were having the coordinator frame the issue to align with organizational missions. So when reaching out to an organization, that organization should see their own self-interest reflected in the coalition's work. We also heard from our interviews with other coordinators that there's a struggle to get clear commitments from organizations that they're recruiting. So what we suggest is that coordinators have a very clear ask at the end of each meeting that they're having with potential members. Potential members should know exactly what they need to do in order to get involved in the coalition and what their organization would bring to the table in terms of as an asset for the coalition as a whole. So as I mentioned earlier, interorganizational politics can be a little bit tricky. It became clear early on in my project that turfiness might be something that I have to navigate. So 2 things that I did to do so. First was framing the issue specifically around hunger. I worked with a policy analyst at the Center for Justice, and he pulled some really great data, and he and I created some maps that showed the pervasiveness of hunger in Jackson and a clear gap in services. We're able to use this data to leverage that to create buy-in around the issue of hunger specifically. Secondly, we had a really deliberate and slow growth to the group and started with a smaller core group of organizations that we knew would be supportive. So that was made up of the state's food bank, some direct services organizations, a policy analyst organization, and the Center for Justice itself, which is a legal advocacy firm. And so having that buy-in from the beginning allowed me to go conduct outreach meetings later on and show that there was already buy-in around that issue and bring other folks to the table that may have otherwise been hesitant.
So the third R that we identified was retention. This was especially relevant in my project. As I said, Housing Mississippi's been around for about 6 years, and they've been working on a single campaign and have yet to be successful on it. So understandably, there's some exhaustion around that. There's some burnout, some frustration. So keeping members engaged in that work was really difficult, and we found that in our interviews as well. So through our interviews and through our personal experiences, we identified some key ways to keep coalition members coming back to the table and excited about the work. First of all, have really effective meetings that lead to action. I feel like there's probably a lot of us in this room that have been to meetings before that just leave you feeling really unmotivated and like the group doesn't know where they're going. And that can be a real turnoff for the momentum of the group. Second, to continue that strong relationship building all the way through the coalition's life. So it's not just at the recruitment stage. Coalition coordinators and members need to continue building relationships, need to continue checking in to understand where people are at with the work. Third, bringing in new members. This was a strategy I really pulled on in my work, to bring in kind of new blood, new perspective, new energy. Just having new people come to the table made the older members in the coalition get more excited about it and kind of see the organization moving forward again. So that was really helpful. And lastly, something we heard a lot was just to win something. So even if it isn't the coalition's stated goal, sometimes redirecting energy towards a more winnable issue will kind of reinvigorate the group, build momentum, and show the group that we can win something if we collaborate effectively together. So paying attention to kind of identify some winnable short-term goals was really important to retaining members.
And so being intentional about relationships and recruitment and retention will hopefully lead to results. But there are some things that the coalition coordinator can do in order to make sure that the coalition is effective in reaching its goals and that they can actually quantify the impact that they're having. So our HFCR includes some tools that coordinators can use. Brock and I recommend that coordinators familiarize themselves with logic models. Brian did a really great brief run-through of logic models. And Jenny, yes. And yeah, we've also included some assessment and evaluation tools that coalition coordinators can use as well to make sure that the coalition is reaching its goals, how the coalition should reprioritize their strategies, and what the coalition should look like moving forward, if the coalition should even exist at all.
So that was a lot of information, and our toolkit includes even more information and more recommendations, but I hope we were able to get the point across that coalitions can be a really effective and necessary tool for social change, but they don't just happen, and there are some best practices that coalition coordinators and members can use in order to make their work more effective. But if you all would like to see more of our recommendations, please check out our blog at deepsouthcoalitions.blogspot.com. Ask us questions, and we can tell you more about it. But thank you all for listening.
Thank you.